Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Jennifer Newsom-Martin, the director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm so delighted that you've joined us this evening for a panel discussion of Paul Scherz's latest book, The Ethics of Precision Medicine, The Problems of Prevention in Healthcare. For those of you who may not be familiar with our work, the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture was established in 1999 to share the richness of the Catholic moral and intellectual tradition through teaching, research, and engagement at the highest level and across a range of disciplines. Through our academic research and publications, our Soren Fellows student program, and our work to support a culture of life, we grapple with some of the most vexed questions of ethics, culture, and public policy today, projecting Notre Dame's distinctive voice into the public square on issues relating to justice, human dignity, and the common good. You can learn more about our work on our website, ethicscenter.nd.edu. This afternoon, I'm so pleased to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Paul Scherz, the Our Lady of Guadalupe Professor of Theology here at Notre Dame, and a Mission Fellow of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Scherz earned his PhD in moral theology from Notre Dame in 2014, and a PhD in genetics from Harvard University in 2005. Scherz's research interests include moral theology, Christian ethics, bioethics, and technology ethics, including the uses of artificial intelligence. The Ethics of Precision Medicine is the latest volume in the DeNicola Center's book series with the University of Notre Dame Press, Studies in Medical Ethics and Bioethics. We are so grateful for their partnership and support. Paul will be joined tonight by Mary Hirschfeld, Associate Professor of Theology here at Notre Dame, and two visiting scholars of the DeNicola Center, Christopher Kaczor, Professor of Philosophy from Loyola Marymount University, and Christopher Tollefsen, Professor of Philosophy from the University of South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paul and our colleagues.
Thank you for that introduction, and to the DeNicola Center for holding this event. For all of the panelists, I'm so looking forward to hearing your remarks, and to all of you for coming here. So this book was a long time in developing. It originated actually during my career in genetics, where I saw a shift over the course of the time when I joined genetics in the mid-1990s. We were about finding cures. We were looking for genes that cause diseases and looking for cures for them. Over the next 10 years, till when I left genetics to pursue moral theology in 2008, the field shifted, though. It started looking at risk. What are the genes that cause risk? What risks emerge out of the genome? So if you look at your 23andMe kind of report, you're at 5% increased risk of colon cancer because you're Gen X, or 5% increased risk of heart disease. I was interested in why this shift occurred from cures to risk in the genetics. And over the last 15 years, we've only seen that shift accelerate with the development of precision medicine. This is a research program and actually application in healthcare in which governments and companies are trying to combine all the information from your genetic risk profiles and also your health records. So you're looking at all of your risk, combine it together, feed it through AI and data analytics, and predict your total health risk. And this will be integrated, at least the plans are, into the clinical encounter. So this is something that's being done by the government. There's $1 billion+ research programs with millions of participants being developed. This is being done by private industry. Health systems are developing these kinds of tools to be implemented very rapidly. So my question as we moved is, what are the effects of this? And as I looked at the literature, I frequently saw not a reflection on this kind of new approach towards risk, but more of a question of why don't we do more prevention? I've always wondered, looking at the literature, don't they notice that actually everything that we're doing now, medicine is moving rapidly towards massive amounts of prevention. So this is why I wrote the book. And also at a deeper level, as I moved into middle age, it was apparent, I realized that even in my private life, I was being directed to look at my own health risks, the risks for my children. And the question arose for me is how, as a Christian, as a theologian, do we follow Jesus' command to not worry about tomorrow, to not care about our life, worry about extending our life? How do we do that when we're told to focus on risk? So the argument that I develop in this book is focused on three aspects, I think, of precision medicine, and three problems that arise from that. The first is looking at it from just what are the objective biomedical effects of this, right? So I think if you're doing bioethics or religion and science work, you want to look first at what's going on in the kind of objective research. And what we're seeing is this precision medicine and these preventive works aren't as effective as they're promised. Evidence suggests that a lot of our preventive efforts are not serving their goals because every time you try to intervene to fix a risk, there's side effects and complications. There's difficulties looking at tying population risk to individual patients. And it's also very expensive. You're treating a lot of patients who will never become sick because they're only at risk. They don't actually have disease. The second area I looked at is what is the moral effect on patients? What is the induction of anxiety that occurs when people are told what they're at risk for and told to focus on that? And how does this redirect people away from looking at moral and spiritual goods towards temporal goods, towards just kind of keeping their health at maximal level? And finally, I looked at the effects on institutions. So my earlier book, Tomorrow's Troubles, suggested that institutions use technologies of risk to try to control others in order to further their aims. And in the realm of health, there's been a lot of discussion today in political science by scholars like Giorgio Agamben about the role of optimizing health, the biopolitics that governs our institutions. And so I did find these kinds of institutional effects in the world, that health systems are using these technologies to control the practice of medicine, to control the clinical judgment of doctors on the one hand. On the other hand, I also saw a eugenic potential that lay in these technologies. Of course, a lot of our analytic tools around risk and statistics themselves emerged from early 20th century eugenics. A lot of them kind of look at those outliers of the population. And the question becomes, what happens to those whose risks can't be optimized? And we see this in both people who are abandoned by the system and also those in terms of parents who find themselves at risk, then turning to genetic and reproductive technologies to try to select children to be at less risk. So there's a lot of dangers that I see arising out of these technologies, but of course, not all is lost. It's not totally negative. At the end, I turn to how these can be used positively, the good uses for curative treatments, how we can turn to other forms of prevention through structural kind of adjustments to society and to individual lives. But overall, the book is trying to engage with something that's really transforming our medical system right now. But I fear some of the consequences that are going to emerge from that transformation. So, thank you.
First, we'll hear from Christopher Tollefsen.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this. I really, really enjoyed Paul's book. I'm going to start with a bit of poetry. Some of you might have sympathy for the following sentiments. Oh, for a draught of the vintage that hath been, cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple-stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. Sorry. Oh. I love Notre Dame. So here's some recent specimens of anti-poetry. NBC News, just one drink a day may put your health at risk, federal report finds. University of Colorado Cancer Center, alcohol is a leading cause of cancer, but will the public heed a new warning? And finally, although the list could be extended by many examples, the Los Angeles Times, after the Surgeon General's warning on alcohol, people of faith should rethink sacramental wine. Now, I kept coming back to these headlines while reading Paul's interesting and provocative book, for they manifest, I think, some of the problems that Paul is identifying with preventative medicine. The first is the reduction of some important part of our lives entirely to the risks to health that it brings, with no thought to the other goods that are at stake or the possible burdens that reduction of risk to zero might entail. Where wine is concerned, the focus on risk to health squashes all concern for goods such as conviviality and hospitality. It neglects the associational qualities that make wine so delightful. There's the way in which wine can bring one back to a particular place, a dance, a song, a jest. It likewise neglects the way that wine allows us, at least temporarily, to leave the world and our troubles behind, sometimes alone or sometimes, as Keats says, with thee. These benefits, to say nothing of the livelihood of those who make and sell wine, would be lost if the relatively low risk of moderate drinking to health were the only consideration relevant to the question of whether to drink or not. The Los Angeles Times opinion piece in particular kind of makes me want to cry, that the Holy Eucharist should be bisected, that Christ's connection to wine from his very first moments in his public ministry to his last should be effaced, seems to me a monstrous suggestion. And similarly, in Paul's account, the uniform focus on risks to health and the reduction of risk to zero makes health appear to be the only good at stake. This was most clearly seen, and Paul mentions this a couple of times in our public approach to COVID. It fails to recognize the potential health dangers that treating risk can lead to, and it leads to depersonalization when exclusive focus on risk is mediated by a purely statistical understanding of the patient. Two further features seem to me to connect Paul's book to what I call the Great Wine Scare of 2024 and 2025. Over the course of that period, still ongoing, it felt like every time I looked at the New York Times, I saw headlines about the dangers of alcohol, about the growing number, quote, the growing number of sober curious, about dry January, and of course, about the Surgeon General's warning. We're now into wet February, so that's good. The effect on me, right, of this continual drumbeat of news headlines and articles was mild, but it was real and clearly vividly felt by others. That effect was some anxiety manifesting itself in suspicion of alcohol, suspicion of wine. Eric Asimov, who's the wine writer for the New York Times and a wine lover, clearly, if ever there was one, felt the chill of that anxiety himself, and he subjected his daily wine drinking practices to heightened scrutiny and defense, as did the commenters on his article when he did this. Now, it might seem inflationary to see it, but I did find myself becoming somewhat alienated from wine, to say nothing of whiskey. Now, Paul makes similar claims, as he mentioned, about preventative medicine. The focus on risk moves the anxiety and alienation of illness, the sense that one's body has betrayed one and that more betrayal is in store, to the realm of experienced health. I feel nothing wrong with me right now, but my risk profile encourages me to think of my body as flawed, as containing within itself the seeds of its own destruction. And one can, I think, also see indications of a larger scale social effort at social control, of which Paul warns us in the medical context in the Surgeon General's intervention. So in an essay in National Review by Noah Rothman argues that the intended effect of the warning is not to change people's behavior simply by means of their new knowledge, but also to drive the price of alcohol up in order to, quote, compensate for the additional cost imposed on manufacturers and to offset the losses associated with negative perceptions of their products. Producers will boost prices, end quote. This is going to, in part, accomplish the desired reduction in consumption as much as the increased information is. And one could also wonder, I think, about insurance. My own health plan requires me to testify that I don't smoke in order to avoid higher premiums. Will my alcohol consumption face similar scrutiny? What to do? Once again, I think my prescription where wine is concerned follows to a considerable extent Paul's in the domain of medicine. Paul recommends a virtue approach, and so do I. If one drinks, one should drink virtuously, at the right times, usually with food, with the right people, friends, though sometimes with enemies, and in the right way, not too much, not too often, not before driving, and so on. I think these are familiar folk ways of drinking that are responsive to the various risks of wine and other alcohol, not just those related to cancer. Those risks are probably well known, but just to my mind, I always remember in thinking about this, the time that I went to a wine bar with my wife and complained about a colleague's behavior at a faculty meeting. I hosted a party the next night, and that faculty meeting showed up with my server as his date. I learned a valuable lesson about wine and talking. So I take a lot of Paul's diagnosis and recommendations to be salutary, but here are two areas in which I have borderline doubts, right? I'm not saying that I actually doubt what he's saying, but maybe borderline. I'm doubt adjacent, right? So, and the first of these, I think, is in a way peripheral to the central topic, although maybe points out to, there's maybe preventative medicine and precision medicine are two different things in the book, right? Sometimes that's not, but it could be unclear just from the title, but I think this came out in his comments as well. They're not quite the same, right? This concerns, my first doubt concerns spending on cancer research in the West, which Paul discusses in comparison with expanding effective treatments worldwide, right? You could spend a lot of money on treatment, or you could spend somewhat less than that money, I take it, and be rather more effective in treating cancer with effectively known treatments across the world. Now, Paul writes in chapter 13 of the book, quote, "Is it just to spend billions of dollars for marginal gains in life expectancy among the world's wealthiest nations through risk reduction when there are easy ways to save many more young lives with that money? I doubt it. That is not to say that some research should not be done on this front, as one never knows where a breakthrough will occur that will help everyone. However, our investment in precision medicine is clearly out of proportion to its possible global benefits and the urgency of the problems it addresses," end quote. Now, I don't have this level of certainty, at least. The benefits of precision medicine in this area seem to be real, and Paul doesn't deny this, and considerable, and they include, for example, the first significant breakthroughs in ovarian cancer treatment in decades, now being extended to other forms of cancer. How to think about the relationship between those gains and worldwide responsibilities seems like a hard and timely problem that requires some more consideration. A second light doubt. I'm sympathetic to Paul's criticisms of over-medicalization and risk prevention and of the prevailing way of thinking not just about a wide variety of social problems and the way of thinking about these problems, such as the problem of loneliness, as medical problems. Paul writes that in many of these areas, our, quote, "primary goal should be shifting social and cultural conditions to allow a healthier lifestyle," end quote. And that in order to do that, quote, "we must change basic structural features of society," end quote. A task requiring what he calls political solutions or political responses in which, quote, "medicine and public health play a little role," end quote. Now here, my sympathy shades a bit into skepticism. Paul writes that political approaches do, quote, "not attempt to manipulate the individual as part of a population. Instead, they attempt to change structural conditions. They try to develop an alternative vision of our shared social life through politics rather than expertise. Most importantly, they should focus on the internal goods of human practices rather than external goods of efficiency and risk." Now, for better or worse, this describes no politics with which I'm familiar. My own work, like Paul's, also draws attention to the need to focus on the internal goods of human practices, such as the practice of medicine in a book called The Way of Medicine or the Practice of Inquiry in an earlier book on that topic. I think the way of reform of such practices needs to come from within the practices themselves, and that political efforts at such reform are in fact likely to be manipulative and to misconstrue the nature of the internal goods of those practices. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding the way in which Paul is thinking of the political here. He's certainly thinking of it in a more Aristotelian mode than, again, I'm not familiar with as a matter of actual practice. But once again, I think this is a hard problem calling for further reflection. But such mild doubts notwithstanding, I want to close with a toast to Paul and to his excellent work in the book. Cheers. Let's take this with me.
Next, we'll hear from Christopher Kaczor.
It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'm very honored to be able to speak in the DeNicola Center and to comment on this fantastic book. So when I go out for a social event, I often ask my wife if I should change anything about what I'm wearing. And often she says to me, no, you have to change everything. I had a similar feeling in reading this book. To be clear, it was not the book that needed to change. It was me that needed to change. And thankfully, I did. My hazy understanding of precision medicine was coupled with an entirely positive stance towards it. I figured if we could figure out our risks for various diseases, and we could act proactively to minimize risk and avoid disease. After all, didn't Benjamin Franklin say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure? What could go wrong with precision medicine? Well, it turns out a lot. The economist Thomas Sowell pointed out, there are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. This is a lesson I too easily forget, but one that the ethics of precision medicine calls to our attention. Every intervention has its costs, if only opportunity costs. So Paul's work has prompted me to consider a number of questions, and some of which I hope we can discuss today. Like Caesar's Gaul, I have divided my comments into 3 parts: A, B, and C. A definition of health. What is it? B, body-self dualism. What are human persons? C, cost-benefit analysis. Why is it insufficient? So A definition of health. Here is the definition of health from the World Health Organization, which is mentioned but not endorsed in this book. Quote, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, end quote. Now, I believe the medical art is not properly understood as aiming at health in this broad sense, and Paul is right not to endorse it. Although gainful employment and rich friendships undoubtedly contribute to a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, it nevertheless falls outside the duties of physician qua physician to secure suitable jobs and rich friendships for their patients. Although I might like the help, it's not the job of doctors to dole out advice about defending arm bars in jiu-jitsu, playing Christmas songs on the piano, or finding the best forest walks in Seattle. So if the World Health Organization definition fails, what about other definitions? Here Paul writes, quote, health is an absence. It is an absence of negative bodily experiences. Since when a person is healthy, there is no dissonances or pains that draw his attention, unquote. Now, I wonder, could there be some cases, however, in which an individual has an absence of negative bodily experiences, but nevertheless still lacks health? Take, for example, a person in a minimally conscious state because of morphine. That individual may not be aware of any negative bodily experiences, but yet may be still about to die from cancer. On the other hand, an individual might have negative bodily experiences subjectively, but also have, at least in a physical sense, no absence of health. Take, for example, a hypochondriac who is convinced he is dying tomorrow and may not have anything at all wrong with his body. I worry, and I suspect Paul shares my worry, that too subjective understandings of health may lead to a view of medicine in which doctors cater to the preferences, however ill-informed, of patients seeking whatever treatment they desire. So my question is, what is a definition of health that avoids these implications? Now on to B, body-self dualism. Paul rightly rejects the Gnostic approach to the body in which, quote, the body is seen as ultimately alien to the self, unquote. But at times, the book seems to speak in ways that could be interpreted as endorsing body-self dualism. Here are some examples. Quote, the body is one's tool for engaging the worlds. Quote, the body ceases to be a predictable medium for acting in the worlds. And quote, someone feeling at home in his body, unquote. So since Paul rejects Gnostic approaches to the body, it would seem he's also committed to rejecting body self-dualism. A rejecting of body self-dualism would lead to the conclusions that my body is not my tool for engaging the world. My body is myself engaging the world. My body isn't a medium for acting in the world. My body is me acting in the world. I am not in my body. I am my body. St. John Paul II put the point as follows. The human body is not just an instrument or item of property, but shares in the individual's value as a human being. It is important to combat the widespread body self-dualism that arises from a Cartesian view of the person and or from strains of contemporary Gnosticism by speaking about the living human body as the human person. As St. Thomas Aquinas notes in commenting on St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, I am not my soul. And finally, C, cost-benefit analysis. The book points out that, quote, conflicts over risk are not resolvable through cost-benefit analysis, unquote. And Paul points out that the research about risk is not entirely reliable, and cost comparisons are complicated by the choice of other values. He is entirely right in this. The cost-benefit analysis of utilitarianism is not enough. As Pope Francis pointed out in Laudato Si', since the world has been given to us, we can no longer view reality in a purely utilitarian way, in which efficiency and productivity are entirely geared to our individual benefit. Now, there's much more to say about this, and I think some important insights are offered by Alistair McIntyre in his little-known essay, Utilitarianism and Cost-Benefit Analysis. All cost-benefit analysis rests on moral values, reflecting a series of choices. The choice of what options to test and what options not to test via cost-benefit analysis. The choice of what counts as a benefit and what counts as a cost, and what is excluded as counting as either. The choice of whose assessments count. Everyone affected, those affected more having more say, only the patient. The choice of the range of effects that count, only immediate effects or also more remote and distant effects. And finally, the choice of time scale used, because in many cases, a cost-benefit analysis shifts depending on the time scale used. So think about building a railroad or something. It may be not cost beneficial considered in a 10-year framework, but cost beneficial considered in a 30-year framework. So, in conclusion, I'm so grateful for having read The Ethics of Precision Medicine. It is an insightful book and a healthy corrective for folks like myself who are almost entirely blind to the risks of precision medicine. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear from Mary Hirschfeld.
So I was honored to be invited to come speak at this panel, but also a bit puzzled. I don't know anything about public health. I'm not a biologist, and I don't even do bioethics. What I am is an economist who became a theologian. Okay. And my work is on our disordered relationship to the instrumental good of wealth and the deep consequences that has for how we think about economics and public policy. So I'm going to be one of these boring people who talks about how Paul's stuff resonates with my own work. But I think I'm justified in doing this. So Paul and I overlapped briefly here at Notre Dame, but I went off to a job at Villanova where I finished my book and started on my career talking about economics and theology. And I'm minding my own business, and I get an email from Paul Scherz saying, I'm putting together a panel, a group of people who want to explore preventative medicine, issues in preventative medicine or risk management, I think. And we'd like you to join us and write a paper, and we'll try to publish these papers together. Okay. And I'm sitting there going, okay. I can see why you might want an economist to talk about risk prevention kinds of stuff. But I was not a health economist, not my area of expertise. And I can see why you'd want a theologian to talk about these things. But again, bioethics, not my area of expertise. But what was really funny about that invitation was, that is so on the nose. I completely want to take up this subject. Okay. And the reason for that is it had actually, questions along that line had been niggling in my brain forever. So even back when I was just an economist, my interest in these questions was still really, really nascent. Something was wrong with economics, but I was just an economist. The subject of healthcare had jumped out to me as some part of the fabric of the same sets of concerns. Specifically, I was listening to an undergraduate presenting her senior thesis on managing healthcare costs, which were starting to rise in a way. And so what kind of economic policies can we do to sort it out? And as I'm listening to her talk, it occurs to me, this problem is not solvable. Step one, why? Because healthcare is what an economist would call a luxury good. It's the kind of good that expands its share of your budget at the richer you get. In contrast to, say, spam, which contracts its budget, share of your budget as you get richer. Okay. You only spend money on it when you have more basic immediate needs like food and shelter covered. Okay. So the demand for luxury goods rises with rising income. Okay. Step two. However, there's a hard limit to how much we can extend life. And because there's that hard limit, we would never, ever experience ourselves as having enough of it. Okay. But that same hard limit basically means the supply curve is what an economist would call inelastic. You can throw money at it, but at some point, we're not getting to immortality. And that would cause a sharp spike in ever-rising medical costs. Okay. So it's an interesting economic problem. Behind that is there's something irrational about how we're thinking about the demand for healthcare here. So hold that thought. But the irony deepens yet further. So I'm still just an economist, and I'm not even Catholic. I'm just spiritual but not religious kind of a stuff. But a few months before what turned out to be my conversion, I ended up in a heated debate with my good friend from graduate school, Tyler Cowen, who is a fairly prominent economist, who is a devout atheist. And it was in the event of the announcement of the news that Dolly the sheep had been born. And I'm just an economist, but there was something about Dolly is a cloned sheep. She was cloned, and the first mammal to be cloned. And there was something about it that struck me as Frankenstein. There's something, I don't even know how to think about it. So I just emailed Tyler, because it's always fun to email Tyler these dumb things. And I just go, what are you thinking about Dolly the sheep? And Tyler delivers his completely and utterly predictable answer, which is, this is the best thing ever. Yeah. This progress is going to, cash out in longer and better lives for more and more people. Go Dolly, let's keep going. Okay, so we start having a debate, and I'm trying to work my way as a complete non-philosopher, non-theologian, just an economist, about why this is bugging me. And I don't have any way to articulate the concerns about Dolly. And by the way, I don't think the church finally decided there's no reason to really be that fussed about it. What was bugging me was the idea that you could use the longer extended lives for everybody as a trump card in any ethical debate. That once he plays that card, there's no response that can be made. And so I started pushing at that assumption. Is that really the right assumption? And I started thinking about it, and we were back and forth and back and forth and forth. Okay. So for Tyler, this is simply utilitarian math. Longer lives are better, full stop, because the happiness of a human lifespan is you take the happiness in 1 year and add it all up. And if you've got 80 of them to add up, you're going to have a bigger number than if you only had 60. Okay, so it's self-evidently true. And more is better than less, and therefore go Dolly. Okay. Now, you might think at this point I'm a monster because it looks like I'm toying with an idea that maybe longer lives are not the end-all and be-all that we should have. But as I was thinking about how do you actually think about this value of extending lives? Does it really add up? That pun is intended. And the first conclusion I came to is that happiness can't properly be thought of as an aggregation across time. It has a lot more to do with the story of a life, the projects people are pursuing, and so on. And that can give you an account about why a life interruption is painful and bad. Okay. But it also says there's not just this standing push to maximize your lifespan. Okay. That idea actually in Nietzsche is my whole book. It's my whole project, because the idea is we think of the project of pursuing happiness as we have these indefinite desires that extend out forever. And if only we could loosen the constraints that keep us from getting everything we want, we would be happier. So more wealth is good because it lets me get more stuff.
And more time is good because it lets me get more stuff. Okay. So my whole work was born actually by starting in the sorts of questions Paul is asking. So on the economic side, I've already said this, but I'll say it again because I wrote it down. The argument is that we think more wealth is always better because more wealth helps us achieve our open-ended desires. But in thinking about wealth and happiness in this way, and it comes to call it constrained maximization, we end up prioritizing the pursuit of wealth, treating it as though it was the ultimate good. But wealth is only ever an instrumental good. And when we start treating it like an intrinsic good, we are tempted severely to start sacrificing intrinsic goods like justice or time for more important things at the altar of getting more wealth. And that's just flat out irrational. It's like giving up the goods of wine for the sake of extending your life. So I think the same form of irrationality, or at least a cousin to it, can be found in the worldview that lies behind preventative medicine. More time is better than less time because it helps us achieve our open-ended desires. And so we aim to extend time. Now, I'm using the word time advisedly. You might say, why am I not talking about promoting better health? The way this comes up in public discourse is actually even worse than that. It's like we want to do this because we want to save lives. Okay. And that's always bugged me. Because in point of fact, there's no policy under the planet that will actually save a life. No lives are ever saved. The only thing that you can do is postpone a death. Okay. Because in fact, everybody dies. Okay. Sorry to break that to you. Okay. And the policy people who are worrying about these health things always talk about years added, time added. Okay. But I also think, it seems to me that in our obsession about extending time, we've forgotten what life really is or what it really means. We're so focused on time, and we're not thinking about what the actual life is. Because part of being a mortal life, to understand life at all, is you have to accept that we die, no matter how much extending of time we do. And compared to what happens when a person dies, a few extra years and the stuff you could have done with it takes on a very different sense of importance. And the intuition here just is when you're finally on your deathbed, it's really not going to matter how much you did. It might matter that your life got cut off in certain projects, but not going from 72 to 76. Okay. And my last course at Villanova was a course trying to explore this difference in the context of the COVID pandemic, which raised a lot of these issues for me. Talking about the difference between time and life. I think it's really important. Just as in economic theology, what is at stake in this question about preventative medicine is the difference between the futile quest to fulfill infinitely extended desires instead of trying to make and live a meaningful life, especially as mortal creatures. Okay. So here's a quick analogy, because part of what kept me up all night last night was how can I make this clear to people in a short amount of time? But the way to see the problem is, and G.K. Chesterton says this, what's wrong with the world is we have shifted our idea about our project in life. Instead of pursuing a goal, we have started thinking about basically these instrumental goods. So the analogy is you come to a fork in a road, you have a choice to make. The current way of thinking about that is which choice maximizes my opportunities? And then you go down that way. And I had a friend who's completely in this mindset trying to figure out which fork in the road to take. And I said, that's the wrong question. Okay. If you're on a path through the woods and you have a fork in the road, another way of asking the question is, given where I'm going, which is the path that gets me there? And if I think about that, I'm not thinking about trade-offs, right? I'm thinking about how do I get where I'm going? We live in a world that's so obsessed with maximizing these potentials, keeping these options open, that we forget the really important human project, which is thinking about what it is we're looking, what goods are we seeking? What are the concrete goods we want? What kind of lives do we want to lead? What sort of projects do we want to engage in? Okay. So, winding up, it seems to me that I want to say the urgent problem in moral theology today, but at least an urgent problem in moral theology today, needs to be resisted to what they want to call this a technocratic impulse, to maximize wealth or to extend time at the expense of doing the urgently important and essentially human work of figuring out the big questions about who am I, what am I doing, in the context of the fact that we're all going to die. The mortality rate, like I said before, is 100%, maybe 99.99999 if you count a few people in the Bible. But no amount of trillions of dollars of spending on healthcare is going to change that fact. No amount of new technologies is going to change that fact. The momentous question is not how long will we live, it's how well we live and why will we live. If you have that perspective settled in and operate out of it as a moral theologian, the next task would be to talk, and Paul does this, what would good healthcare, because health is still a good, just as wealth is still a good. What would good wealth look like? What would good approaches to healthcare look like in light of the fact that we are finite creatures who have to figure out how to have meaningful lives despite the fact that's a good place to end the whole conversation, that we're all going to die.
Thank you so much for those comments. It's really rich and maybe reflect on aspects of the book that I hadn't thought about in a while. And yes, I should use that as my tagline. You're not going to save a life. You're just postponing death. I think that would be great for the bioethics courses and things like that for med students. I try to frequently, I make this point about saving monies, the economic arguments around precision medicine, and everyone gets very disappointed in knowing that actually, if you postpone people's death, it's going to cost more in healthcare costs over their life. So you're not saving money. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but don't do it because you're saving money. In terms of, Chris Tollefsen, the kind of the concern about my vision of politics. Yes, it is somewhat idealized, in that Aristotelian way that Catholic social teaching does. My main point was that we are going to need to make policy shifts to build a healthier society. There are agricultural policies that kind of increase bad diets, things like that. There's transportation policy choices. My point is you're more likely to have those made well, not in the medical system, right? So there's all these medical writers who want to pull those social decision-making into the medical system. And I think that's probably a mistake. In speaking of the technocratic imperative. And in terms of the cancer moonshot, point taken. I think research is good, but I'm just hesitant on all moonshots because I've just seen so many, the Genome Project, stem cells, precision medicine, synthetic bio, again and again, these kinds of big things that are going to save lives, but that we have technologies here that can actually improve people's lives. And how do we reorient ourselves to allow for good research, but also don't build up this hype and hope that we're going to save everyone through this technology, one after another of these technologies. And in terms of my idea of health and the body and the dualism, I mean, these are good points that the way I frame them can be misinterpreted. But I still think that thinking of your body as tools is actually an Aristotelian kind of language, right? The organic body, the organum is an instrument, right? That you're having functions in the world, which is what I was trying to get at. And in part, I think some of the aspects where I was trying to take a phenomenological perspective as to how our relationship to our body actually feels to us at the moment in a subjective manner. Maybe that's not the end of the line, but that's at least the first step as we, when we realize we have illness, right? Then we should try to avoid that as much as possible. But thank you.
Before we open up to questions from the audience, I want to open up to questions from our panelists.
I still want to push back. This is not, it's not directly on what you write, although obviously a sympathy emerged on this point about not saving lives. You're just postponing death, which I don't think either of you want to put too much weight on that. right? But I mean, there does seem something really important about the idea of a natural lifespan, a properly lived lifespan, and that being interrupted in ways that are horrible, both for the people who are involved and, I mean, directly involved, and also for everybody else. And when that interruption is prevented from coming to fulfillment, right? It seems really important that we describe this not as, well, you're still going to die in 30 years or 40 years or 50 years or whatever, but something really good has been accomplished here. Your life has been saved in some real sense of the word. And I think if we were to lose that, I mean, which again, it was a gentle emergence of this language, I think that would be deflationary of genuine medical accomplishments. And I guess this again is not like a deep suspicion that I have of your book, but I do think that on occasion there is a downplaying of the value of what's been accomplished. And even in just the litany of failed things that you've just given, which is a genuine litany, right? I mean, there's all kinds of hype. But it seems to me that relatively often real accomplishments come out of these things that are overly hyped, right? They're not accomplishments that we looked for. But do you think that adult stem cell research, for instance, over the last 20 years, or induced pluripotent stem cell research has been a complete and utter failure? It might not be where we expected it to be. It might not be, also where it's going to be in 20 or 30 years. Should we have never gone down that road at all? Would we be better off if we hadn't? I think I don't want to deflate the level of accomplishment that medicine has actually been involved in over the last several decades.
I guess I'd say two things. I mean, first, it just gets my philosophy of how scientific research should be done. And I think it should be much more broadly spread out rather than, we're going to do this right now, and then this right now, and then this right now. I think a lot of those developments would have come just naturally out of the best people in the field interested in those topics, continuing on that work. A lot of the things we did with stem cells, adult stem cells, right, they've developed since then, but this is a natural trajectory from what was going on before the huge investments in it. So I think the kind of broad language of moonshots and, this is going to be revolutionary actually distorts science in many ways. As to celebrating medicine, I really do want to celebrate medicine. I think actually, theology, if anything, and bioethics has been critical of curative medicine. I mean, one of the reasons that actually we're seeing that preventive efforts are are having less effect over time is because our curative responses to things like heart attacks and breast cancer are just getting so much better. And I celebrate that. And I think part of what this book is doing is saying, let's not throw out kind of our curative, heroic medicine, because in many cases, it is heroic. It is saving people's lives in incredible ways and allowing them to have their restored lifespan. I think putting more research into those kinds of things would be better than trying to reduce, 2% chances of risk of initial, across a broad population.
I didn't see. I had wanted more time to spell out what I was trying to say. So I'm grateful for the question just because it allows me to clarify something. If you start thinking in terms of the good of life, a really important good of life is the shape of the life that you get to move through life stages. And that gives you a quite clear reason why it's good that we can cure the 20-year-old who might otherwise have died of cancer. And if there was some way to do preventative stuff to prevent the 20-year-old from dying, the context of my reflections was more in terms of a lot of this preventative medicine is to try to prevent diseases that are going to emerge in your 70s or your 80s. And part of the reason why they tend not to cash out in terms of expanding actual expected lifespan is because there's a lot of you're already on that path. And so it was trying to say, if you can move away from thinking about life extension, especially at the end of life, towards thinking about the actual goods of medicine in terms of the living project, it would make you think about these trade-offs differently. So.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about your definition of health. Was I correct in thinking that you don't accept the WHO definition, the World Health Organization? Okay, yeah. Yeah. So now, I thought, so could you say more about
my understanding of health is more in line of, kind of someone like Georges Canguilhem. It's the ability to function well. You need the ability to act into the world, right, in good ways, And that's going to be set at different points for different people. Like for an older person, it will be less than for a younger person with a disability that will look less well. But it's a very Aristotelian, like you can act according to human nature in good ways. That is the essence of it. I think there is something like, when do I know that I'm not healthy, right? And I think that is part of when should medicine step in? Medicine generally steps in when someone feels that they can no longer. That kind of ability to act freely into the world, to function well, feels disrupted is when they notice that. The distinction is what I see coming along is health is defined as minimal risk in a lot of this precision, not technically defined. Nobody would technically define it that way, but that's the ideal of health, is the minimization of risk. And I think that's really bad, because then you have medicine coming in and intervening in people's lives who are otherwise going along fine. And that's when normal life, kind of, you're just going day to day, becomes medicalized, right? And you start to feel unhealthy and you start to feel broken.
Just a follow-up to that, sort of follow-up.
Yeah.
So then you spend, I thought this discussion was really interesting in the book of the anxieties that are created in the alienations. But you also mentioned at a couple of different junctures, and this is, I think, an important contrast or comparison point. I think some people have to live with these anxieties and alienations regardless, right? If you've got two parents who both had early onset Alzheimer, then that's how you live your life, right? If your entire family has a history of heart risk, then that's how you live your life. And yet among those people, right, some live with it better and some live with it worse, right? I mean, the phrase like virtue entry point that like popped into my head at a certain point when I was reading your book, right? I mean, because it can enter into the narrative that you're putting out there at different locations, right? It can enter into the location of the clinical exchange between patient and doctor. It could enter into at the level of public policy, but it enters into some people's lives of necessity because they're faced with risk they can't look away from.
Right.
Right. And so the question is, and maybe there's not a simple answer to this, but I mean, why not just say that about all these risks that you're worried about, right? I mean, at worst, they pose risks of alienation and of anxiety and of spending all your time trying to ameliorate them. But if some people can live with those risks and have to, right, why not just say, well, you know, there are other issues, right? But some of the issues that you're worried about, you could say people should just be better at dealing with the risks that they come to find out that they have, right? Or the percentage of risk that they come to find out that they have, rather than experiencing them as anxiety making and alienation inducing.
So if you're in a family with this kind of history, like say, like rather than turn to medicine, just try to kind of adjust yourself to deal with those.
Well, both.
Yeah.
I mean, you're dealing with the illness, but you still have to learn how to live.
Oh, yes.
And some people do that, Bert.
Yeah.
Some people don't.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, anyone who has to, we all have risks, right? We all have risks that we know about, that we don't know about. I mean, and we have risks as we grow older that impinge upon us in kind of dramatic ways. So we all have to learn to live with this risk. I think the point where I was, and I think that holds for people in these families just as much. The point that I was trying to make, and I make it later on in kind of a more objective level, is that this risk of particular diseases is thrust on people in a different way, right? So if you have this family, it truly is much more likely that you are going to have this risk. You're living with it. You've seen it. It makes more sense that this is going to be engaging with you. So on the one hand, it makes sense that someone would go, much more sense that someone would go to the doctor to kind of deal with these. It's not the doctor, the health system evoking out of the person this knowledge that they are at risk, right? They already know that. On the other hand, if at a more objective level, these are the people for which preventive care, preventive treatment, screening is most likely to do the most good with the least kind of side effects, right? If you're targeting these people, they're the ones who are going to benefit from preventive interventions at the most level. So I think there's both a kind of pragmatic cost-benefit analysis, but also in terms of individual anxiety, that targeting these kinds of familial high-risk conditions makes a lot of sense.
Can I just
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah.
That's not quite what I'm getting at.
Okay.
So some of these folk, I mean, if you're in one of these situations where risk is thrust upon, obviously you go to the doctor, right? You take care of it in a variety of ways. But then you can live your life in such a way that the anxiety and alienation weigh you down and make it impossible.
Oh, yes.
Or not, right? You can address it virtuously and come to grips with the way in which your life actually is. And that's not really presented as an option in your book for all these people who are suffering risk of alienation and anxiety because they're being presented with somewhat manufactured, but not entirely manufactured, just that they're not personal. Why not say to them also, like, until my Aristotelian solution is implemented and in place all around the world, people are going to be presented with facts about the risks that they're at, or semi-facts or quasi-facts about the risks that they're at. And you need to learn to live with this virtuously, right? And the way that living with it virtuously is going to look means something like this, right? You can't let yourself get alienated from your body. You can't let yourself live under a cloud of anxiety. You need to think not in terms of how much more can I get, but what kind of life do I need to live? That's equally important a message to give to people who you're concerned about in this large picture of risk as it is to give to people who actually have, a genuine risk of cancer recurrence or a genuine risk of an early death from a heart attack or early onset of Alzheimer's or whatever. Right? It just seems to me like it's an important part of the message that should be given. That I didn't see fully present.
Yeah, no, I think everyone needs to learn about the risk. But I mean, my question was like, should we be thrusting this upon more people? Because there are a lot of people with these familial histories who don't deal with the anxiety well, right? They're thrust into it. So, I mean, I guess, should we be thrusting people into this kind of situation, into this temptation to live with anxiety? And that I have more doubts about, whether that's logical or ethical.
We have some time for questions from the audience.
Thanks. This was really interesting. It occurred to me that part of the reason or one of the causes of people's having if we might say, an unhealthy attitude toward medical risk is that we've got the wrong attitude toward death and illness. But it also might be that we've got an unhealthy attitude toward medical professionals. It would never occur to me to minimize risk when I go on vacation. I satisfice. I don't minimize risk when I invest my pension funds. I satisfice. When it comes to health risks, it's a different thing altogether. And some of it is perhaps my fear of illness and death, but some of it is that I've got a quite different relationship to my doctor than I do to my financial advisor or my travel agent. I mean, there's a power dynamic at work in the medical profession that isn't at work in these others. And I just wonder if you'd care to reflect on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, that people talk about medicine taking almost a priestly or religious role in our society today. There is much greater power emerging from medicine, in part because of its kind of cultural capital, in part because of our fears of death and our inability to kind of deal with those. But yeah, there is a significant difference between the relationship you would have with the financial advisor and the doctor, right? But I mean, I think with the financial advisor also, there's a risk of losing money, but then the risk of losing your life, I think, is also much more kind of solid at that point, right? So that's why I think it's important, and it's important for changes to go in place in the medical profession, right? So the medical profession, if it's going to be telling people they're at risk, people are just going to follow that. They're going to be thinking about that. They're going to follow what the doctor says. So is it important to kind of change how medicine is structured and what they're trying to do? I mean, individuals can do that as they approach the medical profession, but I think it's going to be much harder if it's kind of you're having to push back against your doctor all the time when you go to the doctor. Now, you can find a lot of doctors out there who do take a more constructive approach to risk and are much more reasonable about kind of what they're going to be testing for, what you should treat, what you should screen. And the problem is doctors are losing that freedom to be able to practice according to their clinical judgment because the way precision medicine is being implemented by health systems.
Thanks. This is really fantastic. I was actually persuaded by Chris's reflection on how we can best guide people to manage risk. And I thought that just seemed really wise. But I actually thought you were doing something different with the management of risk. I thought it was coming up in the definition of health. And you were essentially saying that health is kind of a negative concept. We define health as not being sick. And how do we know when people are sick? When they report being sick, when they can't function as well, when they experience pain. And you seem to kind of lean into and endorse that more experiential definition of when people are healthy or sick. So as a moral theologian who's wary of people who rely on experience for normativity, I feel like that just seems wrong, But then it seems like that what you were trying to say is, well, we need to do this because of precision medicine. If it comes out that I'm at a greater percentage for cancer or heart disease or whatnot, I'm actually now, it's not just managing my risk. It's actually, I'm not healthy right now. Mm-hmm. That's what you're reacting against, right? Yeah. The claim that because of higher risk, I'm no longer healthy. So that just seems objectively right, because it's not true that I'm not healthy yet because of my risk is higher correlated with these things. So I guess, is there some middle way to define health or sickness that's not correlational risk increase, which you rightly react against on the one hand, and yet none that on the other hand, kind of my experience of not flourishing or whatnot, because that seems, quite commonly wrong, right? I might think I am flourishing when I'm not. I have a certain disorder of some sort. So can we define health in a way that's not kind of reduction to precision medicine, which I agree with you on, but also not just experience?
So, Chris, and you are pushing me into this area of philosophy of medicine that's just incredibly tangled and been like in fights for 70 years. How do we define health? And then you get it. I pushed out the idea of mental illness. Once you get into that, you get into, it actually goes back 100 years. Like this definition of health has the biostatistical vision of health as one of those. How do you get an objective idea of health? Well, you number it, you quantify it. I think that's wrong in certain ways. And a lot of people, disability activists have pushed back against a lot of those kinds of species norms ideas of health as well, because you can have pretty serious disabilities, but actually be living well in the world. And in some ways, you could call it a health for them. So I do like the idea, kind of more Aristotelian idea of when you're able to function in the world, right? But you have to, that's a specific description around all kinds of functions that you're looking at. And generally or the French philosopher of biology, Georges Canguilhem, is this point that I'm making that you're able to act in the world, right, in a certain way and kind of create your environment in a way, act into your environment in an appropriate manner, I think is a good biological definition of health. But you're never going to get like, this is healthy. Like, this is like my pure description. It's always going to be a fuzzy concept, just because everything in biology is a fuzzy concept.
Quick spot. That's me.
Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit more about risk, and partly this is out of ignorance of what these treatments are. Are the numbers that are generated by this precision medicine, are they reliable accounts of risk? Is there any way to talk about what would count as significant or not significant? To say something about that.
So there's a couple of so frequently they're reported in inaccurate manner. So frequently there's relative risk and absolute risk. So frequently it's reported, what is your risk relative to the population, right? So you might be at 20% higher rate of risk than the population for a disease. But if, say, that cancer is only occurs in 5% of the population, then that's only a 1% absolute increased risk. So that's something that gets misreported a lot. The other problem that's coming up in precision medicine is that when you look at the data on statistics, it all depends on which population you do your studies are. And do you as a patient match that population? So a big problem with a lot of the early precision medicine projects is that the genomes were taken from upper middle class white Europeans, people of European descent, right? So the risks that were discovered there in that population didn't match, like if you had minority populations or populations with different kinds of gene variants running around, right? So a lot of times the scores that they give, the risks they give, will not transfer from population to population, right? And this is a really difficult thing that people are trying to figure out. How do you figure out for any individual whether our scientific risk score actually applies to them? Are they like the population from which the statistics were taken? That makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of it is quite fuzzy, bad.
When you just talk about marriage, if I could
Yeah.
press you on that, what counts as a matching population if you want to compare gene?
Well, this is the problem. So like they're trying to start to come up with like ethnically specific risk scores in some of these, but of course race is not a biological category, right? So I mean, and you have like people trying to decide, so there's a great study that these UCSF anthropologists did of this precision medicine study where they had like an African American risk score, Hispanic risk score, Caucasian risk score, white risk score, and this one participant was her family had moved from Spain to Mexico in the previous generation, and should she be considered European or Hispanic? She didn't know how to understand herself, so it gets very complicated.
Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Tollefsen. So Professor Scherz argues in chapter 8 in favor of against the imposition of COVID vaccine mandates by the state, but it's an argument based on prudence rather than principle, and he draws on a variety of health concerns. And you argue in chapter 8 and 9 in The Way of Medicine that a patient's right to refuse a medical intervention is almost absolute. And you also note that that right must prevail even when the refusal contradicts the demands of practical reason. And my question to you would be, do you consider an imposition of vaccine mandates by the state to be intrinsically unjust? And if you are inclined to hold that view, how would you respond to the Catholic integralist argument, for instance, advanced by Professor Bermue, that there could not be such a thing as patient autonomy or individual rights as such?
Sure. I don't think that they're intrinsically unjust. I think that the context of the doctor-patient context, right, is one in which the doctor's authority is extremely limited, certainly extremely limited relative to the authority of the state, right? And the patient has, in that context, relative to the physician, pretty much an absolute authority to say no to anything that the doctor offers to do to the patient. But I think that is not the same relative status of authority that exists between citizens of the state and political authorities. The political authorities obviously have authority to tell people to do certain things that your doctor could never tell you to do, or to forbid you from doing certain things that your doctor could never forbid you from doing. That leaves open all kinds of questions of prudence, and I think you address these briefly there and at greater length elsewhere that I think are really important to this. I think as a general rule, you should postpone the exercise of authority of that sort, making people take vaccines, except when the consequences of not doing so are pretty overwhelmingly bad. I think those were not met. They were clearly not met at a certain point in the history of COVID, while vaccine mandates were still being discussed. But it's certainly imaginable, right, that in a similar situation, the state would not just be authorized, but have an obligation to say, certainly if you want to work in this particular context, you need to take this vaccine.
One of the most secular contexts you can get is medicine. And with it comes a certain view of life and what doctors and what we achieve. In other words, it's always a triumph when somebody doesn't die. Are you saying that medicine could listen more, to theology? Are you saying that the view of those who do bioethics should insist more on discussions with medicine with regard to the end of life, what is really life? And how can you implement that kind of scheme if you were to even try, given the state of bioethics these days and the state of medicine?
Yeah, I think I'm always arguing that medicine should listen more to theology, and but there's a couple of different. So palliative care has made a huge kind of advances, and hospice care has made huge advances, and there's pushes, especially in Catholic hospitals, to implement these. So I think there are those conversations that are going on about death. But in terms of recognizing finitude, the question that Mary is pushing, right? That's hard for healthcare to hear, right? That is really hard for healthcare to hear, that you have to accept finitude, you have to accept that mortality will come for all of us, and that you should try to cure disease, you should address suffering, but and you should do what you can, but the idea that you're going to erase risk, that is what I'm pushing against and trying to get them to hear. But it's a hard message to get across.
I know there are still more questions. We have a reception outside, so we can continue our conversation. But please join me in thanking Paul, our panelists. And for those who are interested, there will be copies of Paul's book outside for purchase.